Imagine plunging your bare arm into a bucket of freezing ice water. I mean, like, truly freezing.
Yeah, no thank you.
Right. Your skin temperature plummets, your nerves are just screaming at you, but instead of pulling your arm out in agony, you just sit there. You're casually chatting about the weather.
Wow.
You aren't gritting your teeth. You aren't faking it. Your brain has literally turned off the perception of pain.
Which, completely shatters our normal understanding of how the human nervous system is even supposed to operate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we usually view pain as this hardwired biological alarm system that you can't simply ignore just through willpower.
Exactly. And today, we are unpacking a massive stack of source material to understand exactly how that alarm system gets bypassed. We're taking a deep dive into the deeply misunderstood science of hypnosis.
It is so misunderstood.
It really is. So our mission today is to basically strip away all the pop culture myths. The swinging pocket watches, the stage theatrics, the whole idea of magical trances.
Right, get rid of all that.
We want to look exclusively at the hard neuroscience and the historical records. We want to know the actual mechanics of how this works. Is it just a highly effective placebo, a biological altered state, or something far more complex? Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to understand the mechanism, we really have to look at the Victorian origins of the clinical practice.
Mm-hmm.
We are completely bypassing those early sort of mystical theories of like animal magnetism.
Oh, yeah, the really out there stuff.
Yeah, we're going straight to the 1840s to a Scottish surgeon named James Braid. He was really the first to approach this, not as some weird mystical energy transfer, but as a physiological phenomenon happening entirely inside the patient's own nervous system.
Which was huge at the time. And Braid's original method for inducing this state, what we call the hypnotic induction, is incredibly revealing just because of how mechanical it was.
Very mechanical, yeah.
He used a lancet case, which is essentially just a small, shiny medical instrument box. And he would hold this bright object about 8 to 15 inches from a patient's eyes, positioned slightly above their forehead.
And the angle there is the critical detail. I mean, Braid was intentionally forcing the eyes to look upward and inward.
Right.
And that creates this intense physical strain on the levator muscles of the eyelids and literally exhausts the optic nerve.
So he theorized that this physical exhaustion essentially forced the brain to narrow its bandwidth. The pupils contract, then they dilate, and eventually the eyelids just vibrate and close involuntarily. He called it the eye fixation technique.
Yeah, and the reason that's so important is because we see a lot of modern sources claiming there are like 30 to 50 distinct stages of a hypnotic trance.
Oh, right, with the elaborate pendulums and counting backwards from 100.
Exactly, all these drawn-out induction rituals.
Yeah.
But the contemporary research completely undercuts that. Studies actually show the induction ritual itself contributes far less to the hypnotic effect than the field previously assumed.
Really? So the ritual isn't the magic part?
Not at all. The ritual is essentially just a tool to achieve a very specific cognitive state, which is bandwidth narrowing.
It sounds identical to the modern phenomenon of staring at a smartphone screen.
Oh, that's a great point.
Right. Because you stare at that backlit rectangle for so long that your peripheral vision literally drops away. You stop processing the sounds in the room. You don't even hear someone calling your name.
Yeah, you're just totally zoned out.
So does that modern habit perfectly mimic the clinical definition of hypnosis outlined in our sources? Like focused attention and reduced peripheral awareness.
It really does. That intense focal point acts as a funnel. When peripheral awareness drops away, your attention is entirely monopolized by a single stream of information.
Wow.
And in that state, you fulfill the American Psychological Association's criteria for hypnosis, which then opens the door to the core mechanism of the entire practice, which is heightened suggestibility.
Okay, so once you're in that zone, the sources outline this neurological concept called the ideodynamic reflex.
Right, the ideodynamic reflex.
Braid and his colleague, William Carpenter, observed that just the mere idea of a physical sensation can trigger an automatic, hardwired reflex in the body. It completely bypasses conscious intention.
And the classic demonstration of this is the lemon test.
Yes. Okay, I want you, the listener, to try this right now. Picture a bright yellow lemon.
Just really picture it in your mind.
Imagine slicing it in half with a knife. See the juice glistening on the cutting board.
Uh-huh.
Now imagine bringing that lemon up to your mouth and taking a huge, aggressive bite right into the sour flesh. Feel that intense, acidic juice hit the sides of your tongue and the back of your throat.
I'm salivating just listening to you.
Right.
Yeah, if you are actively visualizing that, your salivary glands are activated. You are physically salivating over a piece of fruit that literally does not exist.
Because your brain translated a purely mental image into a secretory motor response. That is the ideodynamic reflex in action.
Exactly. And Braid realized that hypnosis operates by hijacking that natural reflex. By eliminating all those peripheral distractions, the hypnotist makes one single idea so dominant in the subject's mind that the body has no choice but to physically react to it.
Okay, but this brings us to a major pivot in the field. Because in 1994, researcher Irving Kirsch published work characterizing hypnosis as a non-deceptive placebo.
Yes, Kirsch's placebo theory.
His argument was that hypnosis openly utilizes this power of suggestion to amplify placebo effects, relying on the subject's expectations to create the physical reality. But I have to push back on that.
Okay, what's your take?
Calling it a non-deceptive placebo just sounds like a polite way of saying the subject is highly gullible. I mean, if it's just a placebo, doesn't that imply the person is simply falling for a trick?
Well, what's fascinating here is that it actually taps into a much more complex mechanical debate about how the conscious and unconscious mind communicate.
How so?
Because gullibility implies a lack of intelligence or, critical thinking. But hypnosis actually involved a temporary suspension of the critical faculty. Braid originally believed suggestions were processed by the conscious mind, like you focus on the lemon, your body reacts.
Right.
But later hypnotherapists, most notably Milton Erickson, realized the conscious mind is actually a massive obstacle.
Because the conscious mind relies on logic. If a hypnotherapist says, your arm feels no pain, the conscious mind immediately goes, yes, it does. My arm is literally in a bucket of freezing water.
Precisely. Erickson viewed the conscious mind as a rigid gatekeeper. So to get those profound physiological responses, Erickson developed techniques to bypass that gatekeeper entirely.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he utilized metaphors, confusing narratives, and indirect suggestions to speak directly to the unconscious processing centers.
So it's kind of like thinking of the conscious mind like a highly aggressive spam filter on your email inbox.
That's a great analogy.
Right. If a message comes in claiming your arm is completely numb, the spam filter flags it as logically false and just deletes it.
Exactly. Doesn't even let it through.
So Erickson's method was essentially formatting the suggestion to look like a trusted sender. By wrapping the suggestion in a metaphor or a distracting story, the spam filter is like, oh, this looks fine, and lets it through.
Yes.
And once it hits the primary inbox, the unconscious mind, the nervous system executes the command and the pain vanishes.
Exactly. But then the question becomes one of biology. Because if the ideodynamic reflex is a universal human trait, and we all have these cognitive spam filters, is everyone equally capable of receiving these suggestions?
And the standardized data from our sources says absolutely not.
Nope.
The Stanford and Harvard susceptibility scales have been testing this for decades, and the results are actually incredibly stable. Your susceptibility score remains consistent over your entire lifetime.
It's a fixed neurological trait, basically.
Right. The population falls into this rigid bell curve. Roughly 80% are medium, 10% are low or highly resistant, and the top 10% are high, meaning they are profoundly susceptible to hypnotic suggestion.
And that top 10% is really where the most revealing research happens. Deirdre Barrett, who is a Harvard hypnotherapist, investigated the psychological backgrounds of these highly susceptible individuals.
Okay.
But to understand her findings, we first have to look at something called an absorption scale. This measures a person's capacity to become just entirely, completely immersed in a sensory or imaginative experience, blocking out all external reality.
Oh, like when an absorption scale asks questions like, have you ever listened to a piece of music and felt like you were physically floating?
Exactly. Or, do you ever become so deeply involved in a movie that you completely forget you're sitting in a theater?
Yeah, I've definitely had that happen.
So Barrett discovered that the top 10% of hypnotizable people score off the charts on these absorption scales. But they arrive at that neurological state through two completely divergent pathways.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because those pathways are total opposites.
They are. She categorized the first group as fantasizers.
Fantasizers.
Yeah. These individuals typically had very idyllic childhoods. They had imaginary friends, their parents actively encouraged vivid pretend play, and they spent thousands of hours building neural pathways dedicated to intense, joyful imagination.
So they essentially practiced the skill of absorption until it became second nature.
Right.
But Barrett's second group, the dissociators, developed the exact same neurological capacity through severe trauma.
It's really tragic, but yes. The source material indicates dissociators often have histories of childhood abuse. For them, highly focused daydreaming wasn't creative play at all. It was a necessary survival mechanism. When the physical reality became unbearable, their brains learned to build an amnesic wall, basically compartmentalizing the trauma and escaping into a blank, numb state.
And the clinical data backs this up dramatically. Patients diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder and PTSD score the highest of any demographic on hypnotizability scales.
The highest.
Their brains have literally rewired themselves to sever the connection between sensory input and conscious awareness just to survive.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this fundamentally dismantles Kirsch's placebo concept and that whole idea of gullibility we talked about.
Right, because it's so much deeper than that.
Exactly. Hypnosis relies on a profound capacity to alter perception, whether that capacity was cultivated through joyful creativity or forged as a psychological shield. The neurological doorway is the exact same.
Okay, but that brings up a really dark question. If a person's brain is naturally capable of building those walls and completely altering its perception of reality, what happens when an external actor decides to hijack that architecture?
Yeah, the dark side of this.
The deep dive sources detail some chilling historical attempts to weaponize this vulnerability, starting with the 1951 Copenhagen hypnosis murders.
Yes, that case is wild. Palle Harjup walked into a Danish bank, attempted a robbery, and ended up shooting 2 people.
But upon his arrest, Harjup's defense was entirely unprecedented. He claimed he was acting under the hypnotic control of his former cellmate, Bjørn Schau Nielsen.
And the mechanics of how Nielsen accomplished this are crucial. He didn't just, wave a pocket watch and instantly turn Harjup into an assassin.
Right, it wasn't a movie.
No, the 2 men had shared a prison cell for months. Nielsen, who was deeply obsessed with mysticism and hypnosis, identified Harjup's pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities.
He targeted him.
He did. He spent thousands of hours slowly reshaping Harjup's reality, intertwining their identities, and establishing profound psychological dominance.
So he slowly built that control over time. And the Danish courts ultimately convicted Nielsen as the orchestrator of the murders. They recognized that the hypnotic influence was real, but it was predicated on this long-term coercive isolation that eroded Harjup's executive function.
Exactly. It wasn't instant mind control. It was systematic conditioning.
But the United States government saw this potential and invested heavily in trying to replicate it on a massive scale.
Oh, yes. M-Cultra.
Right. Declassified documents detail the CIA's Project M-Cultra, where they actively attempted to create mind-controlled assets for military intelligence.
And the M-Cultra methodology relied heavily on combining hypnosis with synthetic hallucinogens, specifically LSD.
Which sounds terrifying.
It was. But the theoretical framework was brutal, yet logical from an intelligence standpoint.
Because the CIA researchers theorized that LSD would act as a chemical sledgehammer, completely obliterating the subject's conscious defenses, that spam filter we talked about earlier.
Right, just tear the filter down completely.
So with the ego dissolved, the hypnotherapist could step in and implant a new operating directive straight into the raw, unprotected, unconscious mind before the drug wore off.
But here's the thing. Despite years of completely unethical experimentation, a 1966 declassified document concluded the program was a failure regarding reliable military mind control.
Really? Why?
The core limitation they encountered reveals a fundamental rule of hypnosis. You cannot hypnotize a hostile source.
Oh, so you can't just force it on an enemy.
Exactly. The mechanism of hypnosis requires a baseline level of collaboration. Even in the case of the Copenhagen murders, Harjup willingly participated in the early stages of Nielsen's psychological conditioning.
So a captured spy being interrogated by a hostile foreign power inherently rejects the hypnotist's guidance.
Yes. Without that foundational compliance, the brain simply refuses to narrow its bandwidth.
That makes a lot of sense. So what does this all mean for our free will? If someone can be hypnotized into, an erotic trance or to forget a trauma, could they truly be hypnotized to rob a bank against their nature?
Well, the subject's willingness to comply actually explains a massive danger within clinical hypnotherapy, which is the creation of false memories.
Oh, wow.
The American Medical Association and the American Psychological Association have issued severe warnings against using hypnosis to retrieve repressed trauma.
Because if the patient is compliant,
Right. When a highly susceptible patient is in a clinical setting, they are highly motivated to give the therapist what they want. So if the therapist asks a leading question like, "Did someone hurt you in that room?" the patient's critical faculty is suspended.
their spam filter is off.
Exactly. Their imaginative centers instantly render a vivid scenario to comply with the question. And because their capacity for absorption is so high, the brain codes that newly generated imagery as a genuine historical memory.
That is terrifying. The nervous system cannot distinguish between the intensely imagined scenario and a factual event.
It really can't. Which actually leads us perfectly to the most significant scientific controversy in the entire field,
Yeah.
the state versus non-state debate.
Right. This debate basically attempts to answer what is physically happening in the brain during all of this.
Exactly. The state theorists argue that hypnosis is a genuine biologically distinct altered state of consciousness. They say it's completely separate from normal waking life.
And Ernest Hilgard was the pioneer here, utilizing the freezing ice water experiment we mentioned at the very start of the deep dive.
Right. Hilgard developed the neo-dissociation theory. He posited that hypnosis creates an actual amnesic barrier within the brain.
So the executive ego, like the part of you that talks and interacts with the room, is separated from the part of the nervous system that's experiencing the physical trauma of the ice water.
Yes. And Hilgard proved this barrier existed with just a brilliant twist. While his hypnotized subjects were calmly keeping their arms in the freezing water, reporting zero pain, he quietly asked them to lift their index finger if some hidden part of their mind was actually registering the freezing temperature.
And what happened?
70% of the subjects lifted their finger, even as their conscious selves continued to claim they felt nothing. Hilgard called this the hidden observer.
Oh, wow. That suggests a literal structural dividing of consciousness.
It does. But the non-state theorists, led by Theodore Sarbin, reject this entirely.
Of course they do.
Yeah. Sarbin's social role-taking theory argues that there is no distinct biological trance at all. He proposed that subjects are simply engaging in an incredibly deep form of social compliance.
It operates like intense method acting.
Yes, exactly like that.
Like a highly trained method actor playing Hamlet isn't winking at the camera. They commit so fully to the internal reality of the character that if another actor yells at them on stage, their actual heart rate spikes.
Right. Their tear ducts produce real tears.
The actor has convinced their own nervous system that the fictional scenario is real. So the non-state theorists argue hypnosis is just a clinical version of this self-induced belief.
And for decades, psychology was just trapped in this philosophical stalemate. But the advent of modern brain imaging, specifically fMRI technology, finally allowed researchers to look at the physical blood flow inside the brains of hypnotized subjects.
Right. Which brings us to Anna Gruselier. She conducted a landmark fMRI study utilizing the Stroop task.
The Stroop task, right.
For those who don't know, this is a classic cognitive test designed to create mental conflict. You are shown the word BLUE, but the text is printed in red ink. You are asked to name the color of the ink. Under normal conditions, everyone's brain struggles with the conflicting information.
It's surprisingly hard to do. But when Gruselier put highly susceptible subjects into the fMRI scanner under hypnosis, the imaging showed a massive spike in activity in the anterior cingulate gyrus.
And that is the specific region of the brain responsible for evaluating emotional outcomes and resolving conflicting data.
Exactly. They also saw intense activation on the left side of the prefrontal cortex, which handles top-down executive cognitive processing.
So the brain was physically working overtime to resolve the conflict between what the eyes were seeing, the red ink, and the reality the hypnotist had suggested.
Yes, and another pivotal study by Koslin and colleagues stripped away the conflict entirely. They simply instructed hypnotized subjects to hallucinate a color on a blank screen.
Just picture a color.
Right. And the fMRI scans showed that the actual color processing regions of the subject's visual cortex lit up.
Oh, wow. So they weren't just thinking about a color. Their occipital lobes were physically processing visual data that did not exist in the room.
It's wild. But this raises an important question, and it brings the state versus non-state debate to a fascinating threshold. Does the visual cortex lighting up prove the existence of a unique biological trance state?
Or does it prove that the human imagination, when focused intensely enough, can generate top-down processing so powerful that it completely overrides bottom-up sensory input?
Exactly. The scans show that the brain doesn't bother distinguishing between a highly absorbed imagination and physical reality. The state isn't a magical frequency the brain tunes into. It is the sheer, overwhelming power of focused expectation.
Well, we have traced this mechanism for James Braid exhausting the optic nerves with a lancet case in the 1840s through the dark compartmentalization of trauma and CIA experimentation, all the way to the anterior cingulate gyrus resolving cognitive conflict inside an fMRI machine.
It's been quite a journey. And the unifying thread through all of this source material isn't about learning how to manipulate others.
Right.
It is a revelation about the architecture of your own mind. I mean, your nervous system is profoundly malleable. The reality you experience, pain, memory, visual input, is not a fixed objective feed.
No, it's a highly edited construct, deeply vulnerable to suggestion and expectation.
The clinical requirements for altering that construct are clear. Narrow the bandwidth, eliminate peripheral awareness, and introduce a dominant, continuous stream of suggestion that bypasses the critical spam filter.
Which leaves us with a necessary modern question. Consider the architecture of an endless social media feed.
Oh, wow.
The backlit screen serves as the shiny focal point, exhausting the optic nerve. The room around you fades to black. You enter a state of total absorption.
You really do.
And as you scroll, the algorithm feeds you a perfectly tailored, continuous stream of suggestions, ideas, and emotional cues, completely bypassing your conscious resistance. The next time you finally look up from your phone and the physical world snaps back into focus, ask yourself, were you, in a very real clinical sense, hypnotized?